There is a quiet paradox in human history. Some of the most complex societies did not disappear in fire or conquest, but in silence, leaving behind earth patterns and absence. Long before modern cities rose in steel and glass, human hands shaped landscapes so vast they could rival places we remember more clearly today. And yet, memory did not keep them. What does it mean for a place to be large, organized, alive, and still fade so completely that it feels almost uncertain to us now? How could a city, possibly larger than London in its time, exist in 1100 America and then vanish without a clear ending? At first, the change would not have been visible as anything resembling a city, because there was no clear line between open land and organized space. Only a slow increase in repetition as groups returned to the same favorable ground more often than before, guided by memory rather than design, choosing places where water remained reliable, where soil recovered after floods, and where different food sources could be reached without long movement. And over time this repeated return began to alter behavior in quiet ways, because when people move less, they begin to notice more, and when they notice more, they begin to act with greater consistency, and that consistency leaves marks, not as deliberate structures, but as patterns that accumulate across seasons and generations, so that paths begin to form where footsteps pass again and again, and open spaces remain clear because they are used often enough to prevent the land from closing in, and small areas begin to take on specific roles without being formally assigned, some for rest, some for preparation of food, some for storing what cannot be consumed immediately, and none of this requires a central plan, because it emerges from the simple fact that the same actions are repeated in the same places, and as this repetition deepens, the distance between individuals and groups gradually decreases, not because of a sudden decision to live closely together, but because the land allows it, reducing the need to spread out in search of resources. And this shift toward proximity marks a subtle but important change in human behavior, because for most of human history, survival depended on movement across wide areas, keeping distance as a way to avoid exhausting what was available. Yet here the environment begins to absorb some of that pressure, allowing people to remain near one another without immediate depletion. And as proximity increases, so does interaction, and interaction begins to stabilize into routine, and routine creates expectation, and expectation anchors people to place, so that children grow up not only learning general skills of survival, but also specific knowledge tied to a particular landscape, understanding where water behaves differently after rain, where certain plants return each season, and where the ground remains stable even when the river rises. And this knowledge is not written but carried through observation and repetition, passing from one generation to the next in ways that become difficult to separate from the place itself. And in this sense, the land is no longer just a setting, but part of the memory system that supports human life. And as this process continues, the traces left behind begin to accumulate more visibly in the archaeological record, with remains of dwellings, storage pits, and tools appearing closer together than before, suggesting not a sudden creation of a dense settlement, but a gradual tightening of space, where activities that were once spread out begin to overlap, and this overlap does not yet form a city, but it creates the conditions from which one can emerge, because once people accept living near one another, new forms of organization become possible, even if they are not immediately recognized as such. And this is where the deeper connection to human origins becomes clear, because the ability to shift from movement to partial stability reflects a long tension within our species, between bodies adapted for travel and minds capable of building familiarity with place. And when the environment supports that familiarity, the balance begins to shift, allowing human groups to remain long enough in one location for small changes to accumulate into larger patterns. And these patterns, repeated across time, quietly prepare the ground for something that will later appear much more complex, even though at this stage it remains almost invisible, existing not as a defined structure, but as a growing density of life anchored to a landscape that can sustain it. Raising a quiet question that does not yet have an answer, not about why people gathered, but about how far such gathering could continue before it transformed into something entirely different. As repeated returns slowly turned into longer stays, the space itself began to hold more than movement. It began to hold continuity, and continuity changes how a place is experienced, because when people expect to come back, they begin to prepare for that return, leaving behind not only objects but intentions, shaping the ground in small ways that make the next stay easier. And over time, these small preparations accumulate into something that feels stable, even if it is never formally declared as permanent. And this quiet shift can be seen in the way materials are used, because instead of carrying everything from one place to another, people begin to rely on what is already there, storing tools, preparing areas for repeated use, and gradually investing effort into the same location rather than distributing it across many. And this does not require a single decision, but emerges from many individual choices that align with the conditions of the environment. And in such a setting, time begins to organize itself differently, because movement once dictated the rhythm of life, following seasons, animals, and shifting resources. But when a place becomes reliable, time can be structured around return rather than departure. And this allows for longer sequences of activity in one location, where tasks are not only about immediate survival, but also about maintaining a space across multiple seasons. And this maintenance introduces a new layer of behavior, where people are no longer only responding to what is present, but also anticipating what will be needed in the future, even if that future is only a short distance away. And this anticipation begins to anchor memory more deeply into place. And archaeological findings from regions along the Mississippi suggest that storage became increasingly important during this stage, not as large-scale accumulation, but as a practical response to seasonal variation where food gathered or grown during one period could be kept for later use, reducing the need to move when resources became less available. And storage itself changes how people relate to space because it requires protection, organization, and repeated access, all of which encourage people to remain nearby. And as more individuals rely on the same stored resources, coordination becomes necessary, even if it is informal and based on shared understanding rather than explicit rules. And this gradual coordination reflects a broader pattern in human evolution, where social structures emerge not from abstract planning but from the need to manage shared conditions. And when people live closer together for longer periods, their actions begin to affect one another more directly, making isolation less possible and cooperation more necessary. And this does not remove conflict but creates ways to limit its impact so that groups can continue functioning within limited space. And at the same time, the environment continues to shape what is possible, because the floodplain does not offer unlimited stability, and seasonal flooding remains a constant presence, reminding those who live there that the land cannot be fully controlled, only understood and adapted to. And this creates a balance between investment and caution, where people build and prepare but remain aware that conditions can change. And this awareness is grounded in repeated experience passed through generations who have observed how the river rises and falls, how the soil shifts, and how certain areas remain more reliable than others. And as generations grow within the same area, the sense of place becomes more layered because it is no longer defined only by immediate use, but also by memory of past use, where certain locations carry a history of activity that influences how they are treated in the present. And this layering does not require written records because it is maintained through shared experience and visible traces left on the land. And over time, this creates continuity that extends beyond individual lifetimes, connecting people to a place in ways that are both practical and deeply embedded in daily routines. And from a biological perspective, this shift toward longer-term settlement begins to interact with human, social, and physical patterns, because living in closer and more consistent proximity affects how groups manage resources, how they organize space, and how they respond to environmental change. And while human bodies remain adapted for movement, the capacity to form stable communities allows people to take advantage of environments that support repeated use. And this interplay between mobility and stability becomes a defining feature of societies moving toward larger forms of settlement. And at this stage, there is still no clear boundary that would define a city, but the conditions that make one possible are becoming more visible, not as a single structure or moment, but as a gradual increase in density, coordination, and continuity, all of which depend on the relationship between people, and land remaining stable enough over time. And this raises a quiet but important question, because once a place begins to hold multiple generations, shared resources and repeated activity, What determines whether it continues to grow or begins to fragment again into smaller, more mobile groups? As continuity deepens across generations, the place itself begins to change in ways that are no longer only about repeated use, but about accumulated intention, because when people expect not only to return, but to remain within the same landscape across much of their lives, they begin to shape it more deliberately, even if that intention is still quiet and gradual. And this is where the difference between a temporary gathering place and an emerging settlement becomes more visible, not through walls or boundaries, but through the increasing effort invested in making the land support a stable presence. Over time, and this effort can be seen in how space is arranged with greater consistency, how certain areas are maintained across seasons rather than abandoned, and how the traces left behind begin to form patterns that persist even when individuals change. And these patterns suggest that the relationship between people and land has shifted from simple use to ongoing modification. And one of the most important aspects of this shift is the growing predictability of food, because without some level of reliable nourishment, no long-term settlement can sustain itself. And in the Mississippi region, this reliability did not come from a single source, but from a combination of natural abundance and human management, where plants were not only gathered, but increasingly encouraged to grow in certain areas, and where knowledge of seasonal cycles allowed people to align their activities with the rhythms of the environment, rather than constantly reacting to uncertainty. And this alignment does not remove risk, but reduces it enough to make longer stays possible. And when food becomes more predictable, other aspects of life can begin to stabilize as well. And as stability increases, the structure of daily life begins to shift in subtle ways, because time can now be divided not only by immediate needs, but by repeated tasks that follow a more regular pattern. And this allows for the development of routines that extend beyond survival, where some individuals may spend more time on specific activities while others focus on different roles. And although these roles are not rigidly defined, they begin to create a form of organization that reflects the needs of a more concentrated population. And this concentration brings both advantages and pressures, because while it allows for shared effort and knowledge, it also requires careful balance to avoid overuse of local resources. And archaeological evidence suggests that during this stage, the physical traces of human activity become more pronounced, with features such as earthworks, prepared surfaces, and structured spaces indicating a level of coordination that goes beyond individual households. And while it is important not to assume the exact meaning of these structures, their presence shows that groups were capable of organizing labor in ways that produced lasting changes to the landscape. And this ability to coordinate effort across many individuals is a key step in the formation of larger settlements, because it reflects not only shared needs, but also shared expectations about how space should be used and maintained. And from a broader human perspective, this stage represents a significant point in the long transition from mobility to stability, because it demonstrates how environmental conditions and human behavior interact over time to create new forms of living. And this interaction is not unique to one place, but part of a wider pattern in human history, where certain landscapes allow for increased density and complexity. Yet each instance remains shaped by its specific conditions, and in the Mississippi floodplain, those conditions include the constant presence of the river, the fertility of the soil, and the seasonal rhythms that both support and challenge human settlement. And at the same time, the growing stability of the settlement begins to influence how people think about space and belonging. Because when multiple generations live in the same area, the connection to that place becomes more than practical. It becomes part of continuity, even if that continuity is not expressed in ways we can fully reconstruct. And this deepening connection may influence how land is used, how resources are shared, and how continuity is maintained across time. And while we must be careful not to assign specific beliefs or intentions without evidence, the persistence of settlement itself suggests that the place held meaning beyond immediate survival. And yet even as these patterns strengthen, the balance remains delicate, because the same factors that allow a settlement to grow can also create new pressures, and increased population means greater demand on local resources, while environmental changes can alter the conditions that once supported stability. And at this stage, There is still no clear indication of a city in the sense we might imagine, but the foundations are now firmly in place, with a landscape that can support sustained human presence, a population that has adapted to living in closer proximity and a growing capacity for coordination and shared effort. And it is from this combination that something larger can emerge, not suddenly, but through continued accumulation, raising a final question for this stage of development. Because once a place has reached this level of stability and organization, what forces will shape whether it continues to grow into something more complex or begins to change in ways that lead it in a different direction. What begins as repeated return and gradual stability does not immediately become a large community, but over time, the number of people sharing the same space begins to increase in ways that are subtle at first and then more noticeable. Because when a place proves that it can support life across multiple seasons, it becomes more attractive not only to those who already know it, but also to those who encounter it through movement along the river and surrounding lands. And this process of attraction does not require deliberate expansion, but emerges from contact from the quiet awareness that certain locations offer more reliable conditions than others. And as more individuals and small groups begin to spend time in the same area, the density of human presence slowly rises, not in a uniform way, but through overlapping patterns of use that begin to converge. And at this stage, the idea of a community is still forming, not as a fixed structure, but as a pattern of repeated interaction. Because when people remain near one another for longer periods, their activities begin to align in ways that create shared rhythms where the timing of work, rest, and movement becomes influenced not only by the environment but also by the presence of others. And this alignment does not require centralized control, but develops through observation and adjustment, as individuals respond to what others are doing and gradually settle into patterns that reduce conflict and increase efficiency. And over time, these patterns create a sense of predictability that makes living in closer proximity more sustainable. And archaeological evidence suggests that during this period, the spatial organization of activity becomes more complex, with areas that appear to serve different functions emerging within the same general location. And while we cannot assign precise meanings to these spaces, their consistent presence indicates that people were beginning to structure their environment in ways that reflect a growing population, separating activities not only for practical reasons but also as a way to manage the increased density of life. And this separation does not imply rigid boundaries, but suggests an awareness of how space can be used to support different needs within a shared environment. And from a biological perspective, increasing population density introduces new challenges that must be managed if the group is to remain stable, because living in closer quarters affects how resources are distributed, how waste is handled, and how individuals interact with one another on a daily basis. And while early human groups were adapted to small mobile units, this shift toward larger and more stable populations requires adjustments in behavior that reduce the risks associated with proximity. And these adjustments may take the form of routines, practices, or informal rules that help maintain balance within the group, even if they are not formally defined or recorded. And at the same time, the presence of multiple generations within the same space begins to create a layered social structure, because individuals of different ages contribute in different ways and carry different forms of knowledge. And this diversity within the group can support more complex patterns of activity, allowing some members to focus on tasks that extend beyond immediate survival, while others maintain the daily functions that sustain the community. And this distribution of roles is not fixed but flexible, adapting to changing conditions while still providing a degree of continuity across time. And the river continues to play a central role in this process, not only as a source of resources, but as a pathway that connects this growing community to a wider network of people and places. And through these connections, materials, ideas, and practices can move across distances without the need for a single organizing authority. And this flow of exchange contributes to the gradual expansion of the community by introducing new elements that can be adapted to local conditions, further increasing the capacity of the settlement to support a larger population. And if we consider this stage in relation to the deeper history of our species, the significance becomes clearer because for most of human existence, groups remained relatively small and mobile, limiting the scale of interaction and organization. Yet here we begin to see the early formation of a different pattern where larger numbers of people share the same space over extended periods of time. And this shift is not driven by a single innovation, but by the alignment of environmental stability, social adaptation, and accumulated knowledge, all of which allow the group to move beyond the constraints that once required constant movement. And yet, even as the community grows, it remains dependent on the same underlying conditions that made it possible in the first place, because the land must continue to provide the resources needed to sustain life, and the social patterns that support cooperation must remain flexible enough to respond to change. And this dependence creates a balance that is both enabling and limiting, allowing the population to increase while also setting boundaries on how far that increase can go without creating new forms of pressure. And this raises an important question as the density of life continues to rise, because at what point does a gathering of people become something more structured and enduring? And how does that transformation begin to reshape both the landscape and the people who live within it? As the number of people sharing the same space continues to grow, the patterns that once emerged quietly from repetition begin to require a higher level of coordination, not as a formal system, but as a natural response to increased complexity. Because when more individuals depend on the same land and resources, their actions begin to intersect more often, and these intersections create both opportunities and pressures that must be managed if the community is to remain stable. And this management does not come from a single source of authority, but from the gradual alignment of behavior where people adjust their actions based on what they observe around them, creating shared expectations that guide daily life, without the need for explicit rules. And over time, these expectations become part of the structure of the community itself. And one of the clearest signs of this shift is the way space begins to be used with greater intention. Because as population density increases, the need to organize activity becomes more important, and areas that were once flexible in their use begin to take on more consistent roles, not through strict boundaries, but through repeated patterns that make certain functions more efficient in specific locations. And this can be seen in the archaeological record through the clustering of features that suggest cooking, storage, or other forms of activity occurring in relatively stable areas, indicating that people were not only living close together, but also beginning to coordinate how they used the shared environment in order to reduce conflict and improve efficiency. And at the same time, the growing community must manage the distribution of resources in ways that go beyond individual households, because when many people rely on the same sources of food and materials, access becomes a shared concern, and this requires forms of cooperation that extend across the group, even if they are informal and based on mutual understanding rather than formal systems. And such cooperation may involve the timing of activities, the sharing of labor, or the maintenance of certain areas that support the needs of many. And these practices help to maintain balance within the community while allowing it to continue growing. And from a biological perspective, living in larger and more stable groups also influences how people interact on a daily level, because increased proximity requires greater tolerance for others and more consistent ways of managing social relationships. And while early human groups were capable of cooperation in small numbers, this expansion in scale requires additional layers of behavior that support cohesion over longer periods. And these layers may include shared practices, routines, forms of communication that help maintain understanding within the group even if they leave little direct trace in the archaeological record. And the presence of multiple generations within the same community further adds to this complexity, because knowledge is no longer only about immediate survival, but also about maintaining continuity across time, and older individuals may carry experience that helps guide decisions while younger. Individuals contribute energy and adaptability, creating a balance that supports both stability and change. And this generational structure allows the community to retain knowledge even as individuals come and go, reinforcing the connection between people and place. And at the same time, the river continues to connect this growing settlement to a wider network, allowing for the movement of materials and ideas that can support further development. And this exchange does not necessarily imply large-scale trade in the modern sense, but reflects a gradual flow of interaction that expands the range of resources and practices available to the community, and this wider connection helps to reduce isolation while also introducing new elements that must be integrated into the existing structure. And if we step back and consider this process in relation to the broader history of human societies, it becomes clear that this stage represents a transition point where the scale of interaction begins to exceed what is possible in small, mobile groups, and this shift does not erase the earlier patterns of human life, but builds upon them, combining mobility with emerging stability in ways that allow for greater complexity without losing the flexibility needed to respond to environmental change. And yet this increasing complexity also brings new forms of vulnerability, because as more people depend on the same system, any disruption to that system can have wider effects, and the balance between growth and stability becomes more delicate, requiring constant adjustment to maintain. And this raises a deeper question about the nature of such communities, because as they become more organized and more dependent on shared conditions, what determines whether they continue to expand into something even larger or begin to encounter limits that alter their path in less visible ways? As the community continues to grow and patterns of coordination become more consistent, the space begins to carry a new kind of weight, not only as a place where people live, but as a place that must be maintained across time for many individuals at once. And this maintenance requires a level of shared understanding that goes beyond simple repetition, because when a larger number of people depend on the same environment, small disruptions can spread more easily. And this creates a need for behaviors that support stability at a broader scale, even if those behaviors remain informal and are not recorded in ways we can fully observe today. And one of the ways this appears is through increasing regularity in how space is organized, where certain areas are not only used repeatedly but preserved in ways that suggest an awareness of their importance to the whole group, and this growing sense of shared space begins to influence how people move within the settlement, because movement is no longer only about reaching resources, but also about navigating around others, and as paths become more defined, begin to channel activity in predictable ways, reducing uncertainty and allowing individuals to anticipate how space will be used at different times. And this predictability helps to support a larger population by minimizing conflict and making daily life more efficient. And over time, these paths and patterns of movement can become embedded in the landscape itself, leaving traces that persist even when the people who created them are no longer present. And at the same time, the increasing density of life requires more careful management of the relationship between people and resources, because as demand grows, the margin for imbalance becomes smaller, and this does not necessarily lead to immediate scarcity, but creates conditions where small changes in the environment or in social behavior can have wider effects. And this sensitivity may encourage practices that help distribute pressure more evenly, such as varying the use of certain areas or adjusting the timing of activities. And while we cannot observe these practices directly, their necessity can be inferred from the fact that the settlement continues to function despite the challenges of increased population. And from a biological and social perspective, living in such a setting requires a continued adjustment in how individuals relate to one another, because proximity over long periods can intensify both cooperation and tension, and maintaining cohesion within a larger group depends on the ability to balance these forces in ways that allow the community to persist. And this balance may involve shared routines, forms of communication, or expectations that help regulate interaction, creating a framework within which individuals can coexist without constant conflict. And although these frameworks are not preserved in physical form, their effects can be seen in the sustained occupation of the site over time, and the presence of multiple generations further deepens this complexity, because the community must not only function in the present, but also carry knowledge forward, ensuring that the practices that support stability are maintained and adapted as conditions change. And this transmission of knowledge does not rely on written records, but on repeated action, observation, and shared experience, creating a form of continuity that is closely tied to the place itself. And as new generations grow up within this environment, they inherit not only the physical space, but also the patterns of behavior that have developed within it. And at the same time, the connection to the wider world through the river and surrounding networks continues to influence the settlement, bringing in new materials and ideas that can be integrated into existing practices, and this ongoing interaction helps to support growth by expanding the range of possibilities available to the community, while also introducing new elements that must be balanced with exhilarating conditions, and this dynamic between internal stability and external connection becomes an important factor in how the settlement develops over time. And if we consider this stage in relation to the long history of human development, it represents a point where the accumulation of small changes has created a system that is capable of sustaining a relatively large and stable population. And this system is not defined by a single feature, but by the brokerable interaction of many elements, including environment, social behavior, and accumulated knowledge, all of which must remain aligned for the settlement to continue functioning. And yet this alignment is never permanent, because both the environment and the community are constantly changing, and maintaining balance requires continuous adjustment rather than fixed solutions. And as the settlement reaches this level of organization, the possibility of further growth becomes more tangible, but so does the risk of imbalance, because increasing scale brings both greater capacity and greater vulnerability, and the same. Structures that support stability can also become points of strain if conditions shift. And this raises a final question at this stage, because once a community has developed the ability to sustain a larger population within a shared space, what determines whether it will continue to expand into something we might recognize as a city, or begin to encounter limits that reshape its path in quieter and less visible ways? As the settlement reaches a point where stability, population, and coordination begin to align, a new form of construction slowly emerges, not as an imitation of stone cities seen elsewhere in the world, but as a continuation of the same relationship between people and land that has been developing over generations. Because in this region the materials available do not encourage the building of permanent stone structures, and yet this absence does not prevent complexity. It simply shapes how that complexity takes form, and instead of rising upward in durable materials, the settlement begins to expand outward and upward through earth itself, using soil as both structure and symbol. And this shift is not sudden but grows from repeated actions, where soil is moved, shaped, and compacted over time, gradually forming features that persist beyond individual lifetimes. And these earthworks do not appear all at once as finished forms, but as the result of continuous effort where each layer is added through labour that is both practical and coordinated. And the presence of such structures suggests that the community has reached a level of organisation where large groups of people can contribute to a shared project over extended periods, even if the exact methods of coordination are not preserved in detail. And this ability to direct collective effort marks an important transition because it indicates that the settlement is no longer defined only by individual or household activity, but by actions that involve the community as a whole, creating features that shape how space is experienced and used. And at the same time, these constructions remain closely tied to the environment because they are built from the same material that surrounds them, rising from the land rather than standing apart from it. And this creates a landscape where human activity and natural form are difficult to separate, where elevated areas may serve multiple purposes depending on how they are used over time. And while it is important not to assign specific meanings without evidence, the scale and persistence of these features suggest that they played a significant role in the organization of the settlement, influencing movement, visibility, and the arrangement of space. And from an archaeological perspective, the presence of such earthworks provides one of the clearest indications that the settlement has reached a level of complexity that approaches what we might recognize as an early urban form, not because it matches later cities in structure or technology, but because it reflects a concentration of population, coordination of labour, and modification of the landscape that extends beyond simple habitation. And yet it remains important to understand that this form of development follows its own path shaped by local conditions rather than external models, and therefore must be understood on its own terms rather than compared directly to other regions. And at the same time, the continued reliance on organic materials such as wood and earth means that much of the settlement does not survive in a visible form over long periods, and what remains in the present is only a partial record of what once existed, and this absence can create the impression of simplicity when in fact the original environment may have been far more structured and active than the surviving traces suggest. And this highlights a broader challenge in interpreting early settlements, where the durability of materials influences what we are able to see and what remains hidden. And from a broader human perspective, this stage reflects an important aspect of our species, which is the ability to create complex systems without relying on the same technologies across different environments, because while some societies develop through stone and metal, others achieve similar levels of organization through different means, and this diversity does not represent a difference in capacity, but a difference in adaptation, showing how human groups can shape their surroundings in ways that align with the resources available to them while still achieving forms of stability and coordination that support large populations. And as these constructions become more prominent, the settlement begins to take on a more defined spatial structure, where certain areas stand out within the landscape, not only because of their physical form, but because of how they organize activity around them, and this emerging structure does not require written plans or formal design, but grows from the accumulated choices of many individuals over time, creating a pattern that becomes increasingly difficult to change as it expands. And this growing permanence raises an important question, because once a settlement begins to shape the land in lasting ways, how does that transformation influence the future development of the community, and what new possibilities or limitations does it introduce as the scale continues to increase? As these earthworks continue to grow through repeated labor and shared effort, they begin to do more than simply occupy space. They start to organize it, because once certain areas are raised, shaped, or cleared in consistent ways, they influence how people move, where they gather, and how different activities are arranged across the settlement. And this influence does not require explicit planning in the modern sense, but emerges from the interaction between structure and behavior, where each change to the landscape creates new patterns of use that in turn reinforce the importance of those changes. And over time, this feedback between construction and activity gives the settlement a more defined spatial logic, even if it is never formally described or recorded. And one of the key aspects of this emerging structure is the creation of variation within the landscape, where not all spaces are equal in form or function, and some areas become more central, more visible, or more frequently used than others. And this variation allows the growing population to organize itself more effectively, because different types of activity can take place in different locations, reducing overlap and helping to manage the increasing density of life. And the presence of elevated areas created through earthworks plays a significant role in this process, because elevation changes how space is perceived and used, offering points of visibility that allow individuals to observe the surrounding area while also creating surfaces that may remain more stable during periods of flooding. And while we must be careful not to assign specific purposes without direct evidence, it is reasonable to understand that such features would have influenced how people interacted with their environment, providing advantages that could be used in multiple ways depending on the needs of the community. And over time, these elevated spaces may have become focal points within the settlement, not necessarily because of symbolic meaning, but because of their practical value in organizing activity and movement. And at the same time, the construction of these features requires sustained coordination across many individuals, which suggests that the community has developed ways to align effort over extended periods. And this alignment may involve shared timing, repeated routines, or forms of cooperation that allow large tasks to be completed without the need for centralized control as we understand it today. And this capacity for coordinated labor is one of the defining characteristics of more complex societies, because it allows for the creation of structures that go beyond the needs of any single household, reflecting the collective investment of the group in shaping their environment. And from an archaeological perspective, the scale and distribution of these earthworks provide important clues about the organization of the settlement, because they show how space was modified in ways that reflect both practical needs, social patterns, And while the exact interpretation of these features remains subject to ongoing study, their presence indicates that the community had reached a level of development where the landscape itself became a medium through which social structure was expressed, even if that expression is not directly readable in the present, and this highlights the importance of considering both what is visible and what may have existed but not survived when attempting to understand such early forms of urban development. And at the same time, the reliance on earth and organic materials means that much of the settlement remains vulnerable to change over time, because these materials do not preserve in the same way as stone or metal and can be altered or erased by natural processes, and this vulnerability affects how the past is perceived, because what remains may only represent a fraction of the original complexity, and this partial record requires careful interpretation to avoid underestimating the scale and organization of the community that once existed. And from a broader human perspective, this stage reflects the capacity of our species to create structured environments that support large populations without relying on standardized forms of construction, showing that complexity can emerge through different pathways depending on local conditions. And in this case, the use of earth as a primary building material demonstrates how people can adapt their methods to align with the resources available, while still achieving a level of organization that supports sustained growth. And this adaptability is a key factor in the diversity of human societies across different regions and time periods. And as the settlement becomes more structured through these processes, the distinction between natural and constructed space becomes increasingly blurred, because the land itself carries the imprint of human activity in ways that shape how future generations will use and understand it. And this continuity between past and present use reinforces the stability of the settlement, while also making it more dependent on the conditions that support it. And this growing dependence raises an important question, because as the landscape becomes more shaped by human effort and more central to the functioning of the community, what happens when the balance between environment and population begins to shift, and how does a system built on gradual accumulation respond to changes that may not be gradual at all? As the built landscape continues to expand through accumulated labor and repeated use, the settlement begins to cross a subtle threshold, where its structure is no longer only a response to immediate needs, but becomes a framework that shapes future behavior, because once space is organized in persistent ways, new generations do not start from the same open conditions as before, but inherit a landscape already arranged, with paths, elevations, and areas of concentrated activity, and this inheritance reduces the need to rediscover how to use the land, while also limiting the range of possible changes, creating a form of stability that is both enabling and constraining at the same time. And this is one of the quiet turning points in the development of large human settlements, where the environment is no longer only natural or only modified, but becomes a layered system carrying the decisions of the past into the present, and within this system, daily life begins to follow patterns that are reinforced not only by social behavior, but by the physical layout itself, guiding movement, directing attention, and shaping how individuals experience space without requiring constant negotiation or explanation. And at this stage, the distinction between individual and collective action becomes more complex, because the structures that exist cannot be created or maintained by a single household, yet they influence the lives of all who live within the settlement, and this creates a shared dependency on the built environment, where the effort of many supports the conditions for all. And this dependency encourages forms of cooperation that extend beyond immediate relationships, because maintaining such a landscape requires continuity across time rather than isolated moments of activity. And even if we cannot fully reconstruct how this cooperation was organized, the presence of enduring features suggests that the community had developed ways to sustain collective effort across multiple generations. And the scale of the settlement at this point also begins to affect how people perceive distance and proximity, because as the area of organized space increases, movement within the settlement becomes a more significant part of daily life. And individuals must navigate not only natural terrain, but also constructed features that guide and sometimes limit their paths. And this internal movement creates a sense of spatial awareness that differs from smaller, more mobile groups, where the boundaries of activity are less defined, and this shift in perception may influence how people think about their place within the community, even if we cannot directly observe those thoughts. And from an archaeological perspective, the increasing scale and complexity of the built environment provides strong evidence that the settlement has moved beyond a simple aggregation of households into something that functions as an integrated system, because the coordination required to create and maintain such features implies a level of organization that supports sustained collective action. And while it is important not to impose modern definitions of a city onto this context, the combination of population density, spatial structure, and coordinated labor suggests that the settlement is approaching a form that can be understood as an early urban center in its own right. And at the same time, the reliance on materials such as earth and wood continues to shape both the development and the preservation of the settlement, because these materials allow for flexibility and adaptation, but do not endure in the same way as stone or metal. And this means that the visible traces we observe today represent only a portion of what once existed, and this partial visibility requires careful interpretation to avoid underestimating the scale and organization of the original environment, reminding us that absence in the record does not necessarily indicate absence in the past. And from a broader perspective in human history, this stage reflects a recurring pattern where the accumulation of small changes over long periods creates systems that appear stable and self-sustaining, yet remain dependent on the conditions that allowed them to form. And this dependency means that even as the settlement grows in scale and complexity, it does not become independent of its environment but remains closely tied to it, relying on the continued balance between natural processes and human activity. And as the settlement approaches this level of integration, the question of its future becomes more complex, because the same structures that support growth also create new forms of vulnerability, and the more the community depends on a shared and organized landscape, the more sensitive it becomes to changes that affect that landscape, whether those changes come from the environment, from shifts in population, or from alterations in the patterns of behavior that have sustained it. And this tension between stability and vulnerability does not resolve itself immediately, but continues to shape the development of the settlement over time, raising a final question for this stage. Because once a place has become structured, enough to guide the lives of those within it, what determines whether it continues to grow into something even more complex, or begins to carry within it the conditions that could eventually lead to its transformation or decline. As the settlement continues to expand in both scale and organization, its relationship with the river becomes more than a simple dependence on water and food, and begins to shape the entire rhythm of life in ways that are constant, but not always visible, because the river does not act as a fixed resource, but as a system that moves, changes, and responds to seasonal cycles, and living alongside it requires an ongoing adjustment that becomes embedded in daily behavior, where the timing of activities, the use of space, and the movement of people all begin to follow patterns influenced by the rise and fall of water levels. And this influence does not need to be consciously recognized to be effective, because over generations it becomes part of the shared knowledge that guides how the community interacts with its environment. And the river also functions as a pathway that connects the settlement to regions far beyond its immediate surroundings, allowing people, materials, and ideas to move along its course in ways that would be difficult to achieve across land alone. And this connectivity does not require a centralized system of exchange, but emerges from repeated contact between groups who share access to the same water routes. And through this contact, the settlement becomes part of a wider network, where information and resources circulate, gradually contributing to its growth and stability while also linking it to changes occurring in other places. And this connection expands the range of possibilities available to the community without separating it from its local environment. And at the same time, the presence of the river introduces a form of uncertainty that cannot be removed, because seasonal flooding can alter the landscape in ways that are both beneficial and disruptive, depositing new layers of fertile soil, while also reshaping the ground and affecting areas that were previously stable. And this dual nature of the river requires a balance between reliance and caution, where the community must take advantage of the resources it provides, while also adapting to the changes it brings. And this adaptation is not a single response, but a continuous process where knowledge is built through repeated observation of how the river behaves over time. And from an archaeological perspective, the influence of the river can be seen in the placement and structure of the settlement, where certain areas appear to have been chosen or modified in ways that reflect an understanding of water patterns, even if that understanding is not formally recorded, and this suggests that the community developed strategies to reduce risk while maintaining access to the benefits provided by the river. And these strategies may include the use of elevated ground, the arrangement of spaces, or the timing of activities in ways that align with seasonal cycles, all of which contribute to the long-term stability of the settlement. And the interaction between the settlement and the river also reflects a deeper aspect of human history, because for much of our existence, waterways have served as both resources and connections, shaping where people live, how they move, and how they interact with others. And in this context, the river becomes more than a physical feature. It becomes part of the structure that supports the development of larger and more complex communities, allowing them to maintain both local stability and wider connections at the same time. And as the population grows and the built environment becomes more defined, the reliance on the river increases not only for immediate needs, but for maintaining the broader system that supports the settlement. And this reliance creates a form of dependency where changes in the river can have effects that extend across many aspects of life, influencing food, availability, movement, and the organization of space. And this interconnectedness means that the stability of the settlement is closely tied to the behavior of the river, even as the community develops ways to manage and adapt to its changes. And at the same time, the river shapes how time is experienced within the settlement, because its cycles provide a rhythm that can be anticipated but not fully controlled, and this rhythm influences when certain activities take place, when resources are most available and when caution is required, creating a temporal structure that is shared across the community and passed from one generation to the next, reinforcing the connection between people and their environment. And, as this relationship deepens, the settlement becomes increasingly integrated with the river system, not as a separate entity, but as part of a larger ecological pattern where human activity and natural processes interact continuously. This integration supports growth by providing resources and connections, but also introduces limits that must be respected if the balance is to be maintained. And this raises an important question, because as the settlement becomes more dependent on the river, while also growing in scale and complexity, what happens when the patterns of the river shift in ways that exceed the community's ability to adapt? And how does a system built on such a close relationship respond to changes that are not entirely predictable? As the relationship between the settlement and the river deepens over time, it begins to influence not only movement and resource use, but also the internal organization of space in ways that reflect an ongoing negotiation between stability and change, because the river does not remain constant and its seasonal variations require the community to adjust how different areas are used across the year, and this adjustment creates a dynamic pattern where certain parts of the settlement may be more active or more suitable during specific periods, while others provide continuity when conditions shift. And this flexibility allows the community to maintain a stable presence without resisting the natural cycles that shape the landscape. And over generations, this pattern of adjustment becomes embedded in how space is understood and used, creating a form of environmental knowledge that is both practical and deeply rooted in repeated experience. And the placement of structures and activity areas within the settlement reflects this understanding, because locations are not chosen randomly, but in relation to how the river behaves. And while we cannot reconstruct every decision, the overall pattern suggests an awareness of which areas are more secure during periods of high water and which provide easier access to resources during more stable conditions. And this awareness does not eliminate risk but helps to distribute it across the settlement, reducing the impact of environmental fluctuations on any single part of the community. And in this way, the organization of space becomes a form of adaptation that allows the population to remain in place despite ongoing change, and at the same time, the river continues to support connections beyond the immediate region, allowing for the movement of goods and ideas that can influence how the settlement develops. And these connections are not constant or uniform, but occur through repeated interactions that gradually introduce new elements into the community. And this process of exchange contributes to both stability and variation, because while it provides access to resources that may not be locally available, it also introduces differences that must be integrated into existing patterns of life. And this integration requires flexibility in how the community organizes itself, allowing it to absorb change without losing cohesion. And from a biological and social perspective, living within this river-influenced system requires ongoing adaptation in behavior, because the environment does not provide a fixed set of conditions, but a range of possibilities that shift over time, and individuals must learn not only how to respond to immediate circumstances, but also how to anticipate changes based on past experience. And this anticipation is supported by the transmission of knowledge across generations, where observations of the river's patterns become part of the shared understanding that guides decision-making, and this continuity of knowledge helps to maintain stability even as conditions vary. And archaeological evidence of this stage can be seen in the way the settlement persists over time, despite the challenges posed by its environment, suggesting that the strategies developed by the community were effective enough to support long-term occupation. And while the specific details of these strategies are not always visible, their results are reflected in the continued presence of human activity across multiple layers of the landscape, indicating that the balance between people and the river was maintained over extended periods. And at the same time, the increasing scale of the settlement means that its dependence on the river also grows, because more people rely on the resources and connections it provides. And this increased dependence amplifies the effects of any changes in the river's behavior, making the system more sensitive to variation even as it becomes more capable of managing it. And this creates a tension where growth enhances both resilience and vulnerability at the same time. And from a broader historical perspective, this stage reflects a common pattern in the development of human societies, where close relationships with natural systems provide the foundation for growth, while also setting the limits within which that growth can occur. And in this case, the river supports the expansion of the settlement by providing resources and connections, but also imposes conditions that cannot be fully controlled, requiring continuous adaptation rather than fixed solutions. And as the settlement continues to operate within this dynamic environment, the question of long-term stability becomes more complex, because the same patterns that have supported growth may not remain effective under all conditions, and changes in the river, whether gradual or sudden, can alter the time balance that has been maintained over generations. And this raises an important question, because as the community becomes more integrated with the rhythms of the river, what happens when those rhythms begin to shift in ways that challenge the knowledge and practices that have sustained the settlement for so long? As the settlement continues to exist within the rhythms of the river over long periods of time, a deeper form of dependence begins to take shape, not only in how resources are gathered or how space is organized, but in how the entire system of life within the community becomes synchronized with patterns that are outside human control. And this synchronization is not imposed but learned gradually through repeated exposure to cycles that are consistent enough to be recognized, yet variable enough to require constant attention. And over generations, this creates a way of living where stability is not defined by permanence, but by the ability to remain aligned with change. And this alignment becomes one of the central conditions that allows the settlement to persist even as the environment continues to shift. And at this stage, the river is no longer simply a feature of the landscape, but functions as a structuring force that shapes both the opportunities and the limits of the community, because its cycles determine when certain activities are possible, when resources are most accessible, and when caution is required. And this influence extends across multiple aspects of life, creating a shared temporal framework that organizes the actions of many individuals without the need for centralized coordination. And this framework is maintained through observation, memory, and the transmission of knowledge, allowing each generation to build upon the experience of those who came before. And at the same time, the increasing scale of the settlement means that more people are affected by the same environmental patterns, and this shared exposure creates a form of collective experience where changes in the river are not isolated events, but events that resonate across the entire community. And this can strengthen cohesion by providing a common reference point for understanding the world, while also increasing the potential impact of disruption. Because when many individuals depend on the same system, any significant change can affect them simultaneously, and this dual effect of unity and vulnerability becomes more pronounced as the population grows. And from an archaeological perspective, the long-term interaction between the settlement and the river can be observed in the persistence of occupation across different environmental phases, suggesting that the community was able to adjust its practices in response to changing conditions rather than abandoning the site immediately when faced with variation. And this ability to adapt indicates a level of resilience that is built not on resisting change, but on integrating it into the structure of daily life. And yet the same evidence also reminds us that such resilience has limits, because continued occupation does not guarantee indefinite stability. And from a biological and social viewpoint, living within a system that requires constant adjustment places specific demands on individuals because it requires attention to patterns that extend beyond immediate experience and an ability to coordinate behavior with others who are responding to the same conditions. And this coordination does not need to be formalized, but must be consistent enough to support the functioning of the group. And over time, such consistency becomes part of the social fabric, shaping how people interact, make decisions, and interpret their environment. And at the same time, the connection to broader networks through the river continues to influence the settlement by introducing new elements that can either support or challenge existing practices. And this ongoing exchange means that the community is never entirely isolated, but remains part of a larger system of interaction where changes in one area can have effects in another, and this interconnectedness adds another layer of complexity to the relationship between the settlement and its environment, because it means that adaptation must take into account not only local conditions, but also influences that originate beyond them. And as the settlement reaches this level of integration with both its immediate environment and wider networks, the balance that supports its existence becomes increasingly intricate, because it depends on the alignment of multiple factors that are not fully controllable, and maintaining this balance requires continuous adjustment rather than fixed solutions, creating a system that is both stable in its persistence and fragile in its dependence. And this tension does not lead to an immediate outcome, but remains present as an underlying condition that shapes the trajectory of the settlement over time, raising a final question for this stage, because when a community becomes so closely aligned with the patterns of its environment, what determines whether that alignment continues to support life or begins to reveal limits that cannot be adjusted to indefinitely. As the settlement continues to expand and stabilize within its river-shaped environment, a gradual transformation begins to take place in how food is produced and managed, not as a sudden invention, but as the result of accumulated knowledge about the land and its cycles, because over time, repeated interaction with the same environment allows people to observe patterns in plant growth, soil behavior, and seasonal change. And these observations begin to influence how resources are gathered, shifting from a reliance on immediate availability toward practices that support more consistent yields. And this shift does not eliminate uncertainty, but reduces it by aligning human activity more closely with the rhythms of the environment, creating a system where food production becomes more predictable, even if it is never fully controlled. And in this process, the fertile soils shaped by the river's cycles play a central role, because periodic flooding deposits layers of nutrients that support plant growth. And while these conditions can vary from year to year, they provide a foundation that can be used repeatedly, and the community's growing familiarity with these patterns allows them to take advantage of specific times and locations where cultivation is more effective, and this does not require formal agricultural systems as seen in later societies, but reflects a continuum where gathering, cultivation, and environmental management overlap, creating a flexible approach that adapts to changing conditions while still supporting a larger population. And as food production becomes more consistent, it begins to support an increase in population, not only by providing more resources, but by reducing the need for constant movement, allowing more people to remain in the same area for longer periods. And this stability reinforces the patterns of settlement that have already begun to form, creating a feedback loop where population growth and resource management support one another. And over time, this loop contributes to the development of a community that is both larger and more interconnected than earlier groups that depended primarily on mobility. And at the same time, the management of food resources introduces new forms of organization within the community, because when production extends beyond immediate consumption, it creates the need to store, distribute, and protect those resources. And while the specific methods may not be fully visible in time, the archaeological record, the presence of features associated with storage, suggests that people were developing ways to manage surplus in ways that support the needs of the group over time. And this management does not necessarily imply formal hierarchy, but indicates a level of coordination that allows resources to be used more effectively across different periods. And from a biological perspective, the shift toward more stable food sources can influence how people interact with their environment and with one another, because it reduces some of the pressures associated with constant movement while introducing new considerations related to maintaining and protecting resources. And this balance between stability and responsibility shapes daily life in ways that are subtle but significant, affecting how time is organized, how labor is distributed, and how individuals contribute to the functioning of the community. And the connection to the broader river network also plays a role in this process because it allows for the movement of plant materials, knowledge, and practices between different groups. And this exchange can introduce new ways of interacting with the environment that may be adapted to local conditions, contributing to the gradual development of more effective food production strategies. And this flow of information supports both continuity and change within the settlement as new elements are integrated into existing patterns. And if we consider this stage in relation to the longer history of human development, it reflects a common transition where increased familiarity with a specific environment leads to more consistent use of its resources, allowing communities to grow in size and complexity without abandoning the flexibility that has supported their survival. And this balance between adaptation and stability is a key factor in the emergence of larger settlements, because it provides the conditions necessary for sustained occupation over extended periods. And as the settlement continues to rely on these evolving patterns of food production, the relationship between people and land becomes even more closely linked, because the success of the community depends on maintaining the conditions that support these resources, and this dependence creates both opportunity and risk. Because while it allows for growth, it also ties the stability of the population to the continued functioning of environmental processes that are not entirely predictable. And this raises an important question, because as food production becomes more central to the life of the settlement, what happens when the patterns that support it begin to change in ways that cannot be easily anticipated or managed? As patterns of food production become more consistent, the way resources are managed within the settlement begins to change in subtle but important ways, because once food is no longer gathered only for immediate use, it introduces the possibility of storing it across time, and this shift creates a new relationship between people and resources, where the present is increasingly connected to the future through the act of preservation. And while the exact forms of storage may vary and are not always clearly visible in the archaeological record, the presence of storage features suggests that the community was developing methods to extend the availability of food beyond the moment it was obtained, allowing for greater stability across changing conditions. And this capacity does not remove uncertainty, but helps to buffer its effects by spreading resources over longer periods. And the emergence of storage also influences how labor is organized, because producing food for storage requires planning and coordination beyond immediate needs. And this planning does not necessarily imply formal leadership, but reflects a growing awareness of time, where activities are aligned, not only with current conditions, but with anticipated future demands. And this awareness becomes part of the shared knowledge within the community, guiding decisions about when to gather, when to cultivate, and how to allocate effort across different tasks. And over time, these patterns contribute to a more structured rhythm of life, where the timing of activities becomes increasingly important. And at the same time, the existence of stored resources introduces new forms of responsibility because food that is preserved must be protected, maintained, and eventually distributed. And this creates a layer of social interaction that extends beyond individual households as access to resources becomes a matter of collective concern. And while we cannot fully reconstruct the specific mechanisms involved, the need to manage shared resources suggests that the community developed ways to coordinate these processes in order to maintain balance and reduce conflict. And this coordination becomes another element that supports the stability of a growing population. And from a biological perspective, the ability to rely on stored food can influence patterns of daily life by reducing the immediate pressure to secure resources at all times, allowing individuals to engage in a wider range of activities that contribute to the functioning of the settlement. And this does not mean that food becomes abundant or that risk disappears, but it does create conditions where effort can be distributed more flexibly across different tasks, supporting both survival and the development of more complex social and spatial structures. And the connection to the river network continues to play a role in this process, because it allows for the movement of resources and ideas that can support improvements in how food is produced and managed, and through repeated interaction. With other groups, the community may encounter new practices that can be adapted to local conditions, contributing to the gradual refinement of storage and distribution strategies. And this exchange reinforces the link between local stability and broader networks, showing how the settlement is both shaped by and connected to a wider world. And archaeological evidence of storage and resource management provides insight into how the settlement functioned over time, because it reflects the ability of the community to anticipate and respond to variation in the environment. And while the details remain incomplete, the presence of such features indicates a level of organization that supports long-term occupation, showing that the settlement was not only growing but also developing mechanisms to sustain that growth across changing conditions. And at the same time, the increasing reliance on stored resources introduces new forms of vulnerability, because anything that affects the production, preservation, or distribution of food can have wider consequences for the community. And this sensitivity means that stability depends not only on the availability of resources but on the continued functioning of the systems that manage them. And disruptions to these systems, whether environmental or social, can create imbalances that are more difficult to absorb as the population grows. And from a broader perspective, this stage reflects a key transition in human history, where the ability to extend resources across time supports the development of larger and more complex communities, while also creating new dependencies that must be managed carefully. And this balance between opportunity and risk becomes an ongoing condition that shapes how the settlement evolves, raising an important question, because as the community becomes more reliant on systems that connect present actions to future outcomes, what happens when those systems encounter limits that cannot be easily adjusted or replaced? As the practices of producing, storing, and distributing food continue to develop, the settlement begins to experience a deeper transformation in how time itself is understood and organized, because when resources can be extended beyond the present moment, daily life is no longer governed only by immediate needs but also by expectations of what will be required in the future. And this shift introduces a longer temporal horizon where decisions are made with an awareness of consequences that unfold over seasons or even across generations. And this awareness does not require formal measurement of time, but emerges from repeated experience where patterns of growth, harvest, and storage become part of a shared understanding that guides behavior. And over time, this creates a rhythm of life that is structured not only by natural cycles, but by the ways in which those cycles are anticipated and managed. And within this evolving system, the distribution of labor becomes more varied, because not all individuals are required to focus on obtaining food at every moment. And this allows for a broader range of activities to emerge, some of which contribute indirectly to the stability of the community by supporting the systems that manage resources. And while we cannot identify all of these roles in detail, the increasing complexity of the settlement suggests that labor was becoming more differentiated, with individuals or groups focusing on specific tasks that together sustain the whole. And this differentiation does not imply rigid roles, but reflects a flexible organization where responsibilities can shift depending on conditions, while still maintaining overall balance. And at the same time, the existence of stored resources creates new relationships between people, because access to food becomes something that must be coordinated across the community. And this coordination requires a level of trust and shared expectation that extends beyond immediate interaction, because individuals must rely on the continuity of systems that ensure resources will be available when needed, and this reliance strengthens the connections between members of the community, while also introducing the possibility of tension if those expectations are not met, and managing this balance becomes an important aspect of maintaining social stability. And from a biological perspective, the ability to rely on a more predictable supply of food can influence patterns of settlement by supporting larger populations over longer periods of time, and this increased stability allows for the continuation of the processes that have been shaping the settlement, including the construction of earthworks, the organization of space, and the integration with the river system. And in this way, food production and management become central elements that support the overall structure of the community. And the connection to the wider network through the river continues to play a role in shaping these developments, because it provides opportunities for the exchange of both materials and ideas that can influence how resources are managed. And through repeated contact with other groups, the settlement may adopt new practices that improve efficiency or resilience, and this exchange contributes to the ongoing evolution of the community by introducing variation that can be integrated into existing systems, allowing them to adapt over time. And archaeological evidence of this stage reflects a settlement that has developed the capacity to sustain itself through a combination of environmental knowledge, social coordination, and material practices. And while the details of daily life remain partially hidden, the overall pattern suggests a level of organization that supports long-term occupation and growth. And this organization is not static, but continues to evolve as new challenges and opportunities arise. And at the same time, the increasing complexity of these systems introduces new forms of vulnerability, because the more interconnected the processes of production, storage, and distribution become, the more dependent the community is on their continued functioning, and disruptions to any part of this system can have effects that extend across the entire settlement, making stability more difficult to maintain as the population grows. And from a broader perspective, this stage represents a point where the accumulation of knowledge and practice has created a system capable of supporting a large and stable community, while also embedding within it the conditions that could challenge that stability. And this dual nature reflects a common pattern in human history, where the same developments that enable growth also create new dependencies that must be managed carefully over time. And this raises a final question for this stage, because as the settlement becomes increasingly shaped by systems that extend across time and space, what determines whether those systems continue to support life or begin to reveal limits that cannot be overcome simply by further adaptation? As the settlement continues to grow in scale and complexity, the patterns that once emerged from shared effort and environmental adaptation begin to take on a more stable form in how people relate to one another, not as fixed systems of authority in the modern sense, but as recurring structures of interaction that help coordinate life across a larger population. Because when many individuals depend on the same environment and the same systems of production and storage, there is an increasing need for consistency in how decisions are made and how actions are aligned, and this consistency does not require formal rules to exist, but can develop through repeated practice, where certain individuals or groups become more involved in organizing activities that affect many others. And over time, these patterns can create a form of social structure that is recognizable even if it is not formally defined. And this emerging structure is closely connected to the management of resources, because coordinating the use of land, the timing of activities, and the distribution of stored food requires a level of agreement that extends beyond individual households. And while this agreement may be informal, it still shapes how people interact and how responsibilities are shared within the community. And this shared framework helps to maintain stability by reducing uncertainty and providing a sense of continuity in how daily life is organized. And at the same time, it allows for flexibility because the absence of rigid systems means that practices can adjust as conditions change. And from an archaeological perspective, the presence of large-scale construction, coordinated resource management, and sustained occupation suggests that the settlement had developed ways to organize collective action across many individuals. And while we cannot directly observe the social relationships that supported this organization, the physical evidence indicates that such relationships must have existed in some form, because the complexity of the settlement requires a level of coordination that goes beyond spontaneous interaction, and this coordination reflects an important stage in the development of larger human communities where social structure begins to support and sustain the systems that allow the population to grow, and at the same time the increasing scale of the community introduces new challenges in maintaining cohesion, because as the number of individuals grows, the likelihood of differences in needs, perspectives, and behavior also increases. And managing these differences requires forms of interaction that allow the group to function despite variation, and these forms may include shared practices, routines, or expectations that help align behavior without eliminating diversity. And this balance between unity and variation becomes a key factor in the stability of the settlement. And from a biological and social perspective, living within a larger and more structured community requires ongoing adjustment in how individuals perceive and respond to others, because interactions are no longer limited to small, familiar groups but extend across a wider network of relationships. This expansion can influence how trust, cooperation, and conflict are managed within the community, shaping patterns of behavior that support long-term coexistence. And the connection to the river and broader networks continues to influence these developments because it introduces new elements that must be integrated into the existing social structure, and this integration requires the community to remain flexible in how it organizes itself, allowing it to absorb change while maintaining cohesion, and this dynamic between stability and adaptation becomes more complex as the settlement grows. And if we consider this stage within the broader history of human development, it represents a point where social organization begins to play a more central role in sustaining large populations, complementing the environmental and material factors that have supported growth up to this point. And this integration of social structure with resource management and environmental adaptation creates a system that is capable of supporting a relatively large and stable community over extended periods. And yet this increasing reliance on shared structures also introduces new forms of vulnerability, because the stability of the community becomes dependent not only on the environment but also on the continued functioning of the relationships that coordinate collective action, and disruptions to these relationships, whether through internal tension or external change, can affect the entire system. And this raises an important question, because as the settlement becomes more organized in how people relate to one another, what determines whether these emerging structures continue to support stability or begin to introduce new forms of imbalance that are less visible but equally significant over time? As the patterns of interaction within the settlement continue to stabilize over time, they begin to produce differences in how individuals and groups are positioned within the shared system, not as sharply defined hierarchies at first, but as gradual variations in responsibility, influence, and access to resources, because when coordination becomes necessary, some roles naturally involve more consistent engagement with organizing activities that affect others, and these roles can lead to increased familiarity with the processes that sustain the community. And over time, this familiarity may translate into a greater ability to guide decisions or influence outcomes, even if such influence is not formally recognized or fixed. And these emerging differences are closely tied to the management of resources, because individuals or groups who are more involved in overseeing storage, distribution, or the timing of production may develop a deeper understanding of how the system functions, and this knowledge can shape how resources are allocated and how decisions are made during periods of uncertainty. And while this does not necessarily create inequality in a rigid sense, it introduces variation in how people contribute to and benefit from the collective system, and this variation becomes part of the evolving structure of the community. And at the same time, the physical layout of the settlement may begin to reflect these differences in subtle ways, because as certain areas become associated with specific activities or responsibilities, the use of space can shift to support those patterns. And while we must be cautious not to impose modern interpretations onto these arrangements, the organization of space can provide clues about how different parts of the community functioned and how roles may have been distributed across the population. And this spatial differentiation contributes to the overall complexity of the settlement. And from an archaeological perspective, the presence of variation in structures, artifacts, and activity areas suggests that the community was not entirely uniform, but contained internal differences that developed over time. And while these differences are often difficult to interpret in detail, they indicate that the settlement had reached a level of organization where diversity in roles and responsibilities was part of its functioning. And this diversity can support stability by allowing different aspects of the system to be managed by those with specific experience or knowledge. And from a biological and social viewpoint, living within a system that includes such variation requires individuals to navigate relationships that are no longer entirely equal in terms of influence or responsibility. And this navigation does not necessarily lead to conflict, but introduces a layer of complexity in how people interact, cooperate, and respond to one another. And over time, these patterns can become embedded in the social fabric, shaping expectations and behavior in ways that support the continued operation of the community. And the connection to the wider river network continues to influence these developments because interaction with other groups can introduce new forms of organization or reinforce existing ones. And through these interactions, the settlement remains part of a broader pattern where social structures evolve in response to both internal dynamics and external influences, and this interconnectedness allows for the exchange of ideas that can affect how roles are understood and how responsibilities are distributed. And at the same time, the emergence of differences within the community also introduces new forms of sensitivity, because the balance between roles, responsibilities, and access to resources must be maintained in order to support cohesion, and disruptions to this balance, whether through environmental change or shifts in population, can create tension that affects the functioning of the entire system, and managing this balance becomes an ongoing process that requires continuous adjustment. And from a broader perspective, this stage reflects a point in human development where social variation becomes an integral part of how larger communities operate, supporting both specialization and coordination, while also creating new dependencies that must be managed over time. And this dual nature of variation, as both a source of strength and a potential challenge, shapes the trajectory of the settlement as it continues to evolve, raising an important question because as differences in roles and influence become more embedded within the community, what determines whether these differences remain balanced within the system or begin to contribute to forms of instability that are less immediately visible but increasingly significant over longer periods. As the internal differences within the settlement continue to develop over time, they begin to settle into patterns that are repeated across generations, not as rigid systems imposed from above, but as tendencies that persist because they are reinforced by the daily functioning of the community. And this persistence gradually shapes expectations about how roles are carried out and how responsibilities are distributed, creating a sense of continuity that supports coordination, even as the population grows. And while these patterns remain flexible, they become recognizable enough to guide behavior without constant negotiation, allowing the settlement to operate with a degree of stability that would be difficult to maintain through spontaneous interaction alone. And within this evolving structure, the relationship between influence and responsibility becomes more closely linked, because individuals or groups who take on roles that affect the broader community must also respond to the outcomes of those roles, and this connection can create a form of balance, where influence is not only a source of advantage but also a source of obligation, and maintaining this balance is important for the overall stability of the system, because it helps to align individual actions with collective needs, even if this alignment is not always complete or without tension. And at the same time, the increasing scale of the settlement means that not all relationships can be direct or personal, and this requires the development of shared practices or norms that allow people to interact with others they may not know closely. And these practices do not need to be formally defined but can emerge from repeated interactions where certain behaviors become expected because they support the functioning of the group. And over time, these expectations contribute to a social environment where cooperation can occur across a wide network of individuals. And from an archaeological perspective, the continuation of large-scale coordinated activity suggests that these social patterns were effective in sustaining collective effort over extended periods. And while we cannot observe the specific interactions that maintained this coordination, the physical evidence indicates that the community was able to align the actions of many individuals in ways that supported both construction and resource management. And this alignment reflects a level of social integration that is essential for the persistence of a settlement of this size. And from a biological and social viewpoint, living within such a system requires individuals to navigate a balance between personal needs and collective expectations. And this navigation becomes part of daily life, shaping how decisions are made and how relationships are maintained. And over time, this balance contributes to the stability of the community by supporting patterns of behavior that allow many individuals to coexist within a shared environment. And the connection to the wider network through the river continues to influence these dynamics by introducing new elements that may alter existing patterns or reinforce them. And this ongoing interaction ensures that the settlement remains part of a broader context where social structures are not fixed but continue to evolve in response to both internal and external factors. And this adaptability is an important aspect of maintaining stability over time. And at the same time, the persistence of these patterns also introduces a form of inertia, because once certain ways of organizing social life become established, they can be difficult to change even when conditions shift. And this inertia can support continuity, but may also limit the community's ability to respond quickly to new challenges, creating a tension between stability and adaptability that becomes more pronounced as the system grows in complexity. And from a broader perspective, this stage represents a point where social organization has become an integral part of the system that sustains the settlement, supporting coordination across a large population, while also embedding within it patterns that influence how change can occur. And this dual role of social structure as both a stabilizing force and a potential constraint shapes the future trajectory of the community, raising an important question, because as these patterns become more deeply embedded, what determines whether they continue to support the balance between individuals and the collective, or begin to limit the ability of the settlement to adjust to changes that require new forms of organization? As the settlement continues to grow and its social patterns become more stable, a new layer of activity begins to emerge that is not directly tied to immediate survival, but still plays a role in maintaining cohesion across the community. And this layer can be seen in the repeated use of certain spaces in ways that suggest shared practices that go beyond daily subsistence. Because when a population reaches a certain scale, the need for coordination is not only practical, but also relational, and shared experiences can help align individuals who may not interact closely in their daily routines, creating a sense of connection that supports the functioning of the larger system without requiring constant direct communication between all members. And over time, these shared practices can become embedded in the physical layout of the settlement, as specific locations are used repeatedly for gatherings or activities that involve multiple groups. And these spaces do not need to be understood in modern terms to be meaningful, because their importance comes from how they are used rather than from any formal designation. And the repeated movement of people toward these areas suggests that they served as points of convergence where the community could come together at certain times. And this convergence can help reinforce shared understanding by creating moments where individual experiences are briefly aligned within a larger collective context. And while we cannot know the exact nature of these gatherings, the consistency with which certain areas are used indicates that they played a role in maintaining the cohesion of the settlement. And at the same time, the existence of such shared spaces reflects the increasing complexity of the community, because they represent an investment of time and effort that is not solely directed toward immediate resource production, and this suggests that the settlement had reached a level of stability where some energy could be directed toward activities that support the social fabric rather than only physical survival, and this shift does not replace the importance of subsistence, but adds another dimension to how the community organizes itself. And from an archaeological perspective, these patterns are often visible through the scale and arrangement of certain features that differ from everyday living spaces. And while their specific functions may not always be clear, their presence indicates that the settlement included areas designed or maintained for purposes that involve larger groups of people. And this distinction between everyday spaces and shared spaces contributes to the overall organization of the settlement by creating a structure where different types of activity can occur without interfering with one another. And from a biological and social viewpoint, participating in shared practices can influence how individuals perceive their place within the community, because it provides a context where they are part of a larger whole, and this experience can support cooperation by reinforcing the connections between individuals even when their daily activities are separate. And over time, these patterns can become part of the social environment, shaping how people relate to one another and how they respond to the needs of the group. And the connection to the broader river network may also influence these developments, because interaction with other groups can introduce new forms of shared practice or reinforce existing ones. And through this interaction, the settlement remains part of a wider pattern where communities develop ways to maintain cohesion as they grow in size and complexity. And this exchange of ideas can contribute to the evolution of how shared spaces are used and understood. And at the same time, the reliance on such practices introduces another layer of dependency, because the cohesion they support becomes part of the stability of the settlement, and if these shared patterns are disrupted, it can affect how individuals coordinate and cooperate with one another, creating subtle changes that may not be immediately visible, but can influence the functioning of the community over time. And managing this aspect of social life becomes increasingly important as the population continues to grow. And from a broader perspective, this stage reflects a point where the development of large human communities includes not only the management of resources and the organization of space, but also the cultivation of shared experiences that help maintain cohesion across many individuals. And this combination of material and social elements creates a system that is both structured and flexible, allowing the settlement to persist while adapting to changing conditions. And this raises an important question, because as these shared practices become more integrated into the life of the community, what determines whether they continue to support cohesion or begin to change in ways that alter how individuals relate to the collective over time? As shared spaces continue to be used across generations, their role within the settlement begins to deepen, not only as locations of gathering, but as anchors of continuity, where repeated actions create a sense of familiarity that extends beyond individual lifetimes. And this continuity does not rely on permanent materials or fixed meanings, but emerges from the repetition of movement, presence, and attention, because when people return to the same places for similar purposes over long periods, those places begin to hold a kind of accumulated significance that shapes how they are experienced. And this significance does not need to be formally expressed to be effective, because it is reinforced through practice rather than explanation, allowing it to persist even as the specific details of each gathering may change. And within this process, the shared use of space begins to influence how memory is structured within the community, because certain locations become associated with patterns of activity that are recognized across generations, and this association helps to organize collective memory not as a record of specific events, but as a framework of recurring experiences. And this framework can support social stability by providing a consistent reference point that individuals can relate to even as other aspects of life change. And in this way, space itself becomes part of how the community maintains continuity over time, and at the same time, the presence of these recurring patterns introduces a form of expectation, because when certain places are used repeatedly for shared activities, individuals may come to anticipate that these practices will continue, and this anticipation helps to coordinate behavior by aligning the actions of many people without requiring direct communication. And while these expectations remain flexible, they contribute to a sense of order within the settlement that supports its functioning as a large and interconnected system. And from an archaeological perspective, the repeated use of specific areas can sometimes be observed through the accumulation of material traces that differ from those found in everyday living spaces. And while the interpretation of these traces must be approached with caution, their presence suggests that certain locations were maintained or revisited in ways that set them apart within the broader landscape. And this distinction provides insight into how the settlement organized not only practical activities but also shared experiences. And from a biological and social viewpoint, participating in recurring collective practices can influence how individuals perceive time and belonging, because it situates them within cycles that extend beyond their immediate experience. This can create a sense of connection to both the community and the past, even without explicit awareness, supporting patterns of cooperation and continuity that are essential for maintaining large populations over long periods. And the connection to the wider river network continues to shape these developments, because interaction with other groups can introduce variations in how shared spaces are used or understood, and this exchange allows the settlement to adapt its practices over time while still maintaining a core pattern of repeated activity, showing how continuity and change can coexist within the same system. And at the same time, the increasing importance of these shared spaces introduces another layer of sensitivity, because their role in maintaining cohesion means that changes in how they are used or perceived can have wider effects on the fair community, and disruptions to these patterns, whether gradual or sudden, can alter the sense of continuity that supports coordination, creating subtle shifts that may influence the stability of the settlement over time. And from a broader perspective, this stage reflects a point where the organization of space extends beyond practical function to include the shaping of memory, expectation, and social connection, creating a system where physical locations contribute to the stability of the community in ways that are not immediately visible but are deeply embedded in daily life. And this integration of space and social experience becomes an important factor in how the settlement continues to function, raising an important question, because as these patterns of repeated use become more deeply rooted, what determines whether they remain flexible enough to adapt to change or become fixed in ways that limit how the community can respond to new conditions over time? As these shared spaces continue to hold repeated patterns of gathering and activity over long stretches of time, they begin to shape not only memory and expectation, but also the way the community understands continuity itself. Because when certain places are revisited across generations, they create a sense that life follows paths that extend beyond individual experience. And this sense does not depend on explicit explanation, but arises from the quiet recognition that others have come before and others will continue after. And in this way, the landscape becomes a medium through which time is experienced, not as a sequence of isolated moments, but as a continuous flow that connects past, present, and future through repeated action. And this continuity can support stability by providing a deeper context within which daily life unfolds. And within this evolving relationship between space and time, the shared use of certain areas may begin to influence how change is perceived, because when practices are repeated in the same locations, variation tends to be measured against what has been done before, and this comparison can create a sense of alignment or deviation that shapes how new behaviors are integrated into the community. And while this does not prevent change, it can guide it in ways that maintain coherence with existing patterns, allowing the settlement to adapt without losing its overall structure. And at the same time, the increasing significance of these spaces introduces a form of attachment that can influence how people respond to shifts in the environment or in social organization. Because when locations are associated with long, standing patterns of activity, they may be valued, not only for their practical use, but for their role in maintaining continuity. And this attachment can support persistence by encouraging the community to remain connected to specific places, even as conditions change. But it can also create challenges if those places are affected by factors that alter their usability. And from an archaeological perspective, the enduring use of particular areas can sometimes be traced through layers of activity that accumulate over time. And while the interpretation of these layers requires caution, their presence suggests that the settlement included locations where continuity was maintained across multiple phases of occupation, and this persistence provides insight into how the community organized its relationship with both space and time, showing that certain aspects of life were intentionally or repeatedly anchored in specific parts of the landscape. And from a biological and social viewpoint, the experience of participating in long-term patterns of shared activity can influence how individuals perceive their connection to the community, because it places them within a sequence that extends beyond their own lifetime. And this perception can support cooperation by reinforcing the idea that individual actions are part of a larger ongoing process, even if that idea is not consciously articulated. And the connection to the wider river network continues to interact with these developments because external influences can introduce new practices that must be reconciled with existing patterns. And this process of integration requires the patterns community to balance continuity with change, allowing new elements to be incorporated without disrupting the structures that support cohesion. And this balance becomes more complex as the settlement grows in both size and interconnectedness. And at the same time, the reliance on continuity introduces a form of inertia, because patterns that have been repeated over long periods may be resistant to rapid change, even when conditions shift, and this resistance can support stability by preventing abrupt disruption, but may also limit the ability of the community to adapt quickly to new challenges, creating a tension between the value of continuity and the need for flexibility. And from a broader perspective, this stage reflects a point where the development of large human communities involves not only the management of resources and social relationships, but also the shaping of how time and continuity are experienced through shared interaction with space. And this integration creates a system that is capable of sustaining a large population, while also embedding within it patterns that influence how change can occur. And this dual role of continuity as both a source of stability and a potential constraint shapes the future of the settlement, raising an important question. Because as these patterns become more deeply rooted, what determines whether they continue to support the community's ability to persist or begin to limit its capacity to respond to changes that require a different relationship with the landscape? As the settlement continues across generations within the same landscape, the relationship between people and the environment begins to shift in a quieter but more consequential way, because the land is no longer only a source of resources, but becomes a system that has been shaped by repeated human activity over long periods of time. And this shaping does not always leave immediate or dramatic traces, but accumulates gradually as small changes in how land is used begin to alter its structure and behavior. And over time, these accumulated changes can influence how water moves, how soil forms, and how plants grow, creating a feedback loop where human actions affect the environment, and the altered environment in turn affects future human decisions. And this loop becomes more significant as the population grows, because more people interacting with the same space increases the intensity of these effects, even if each individual action remains small. And within this process, the management of land becomes more than simply choosing where to gather or cultivate, because it now involves maintaining conditions that have already been influenced by earlier activity. And this creates a form of dependency where the success of current practices relies in part on the outcomes of past interactions with the environment. And while this dependency can support stability when conditions remain favorable, it can also introduce sensitivity, because changes in environmental processes may not respond in the same way once the system has been altered. And this means that the relationship between people and land becomes less predictable even as it appears more familiar. And from an archaeological perspective, Evidence of long-term occupation often shows patterns of repeated use that suggest the landscape was being modified in ways that supported continued habitation. And while the exact nature of these modifications may be difficult to reconstruct the overall, pattern indicates that the settlement was not simply adapting to a static environment, but was actively participating in shaping it over time. And this participation reflects an important stage in human development, where the boundary between natural and human influence systems becomes less distinct. And from a biological and social viewpoint, living within an environment that has been shaped by previous generations can influence how individuals perceive their surroundings, because the landscape they experience is already the result of accumulated decisions and actions. And this can create a sense of continuity where the present is embedded within a longer process, even if that process is not fully understood. And this perception may guide behavior by reinforcing practices that appear to maintain stability while making it more difficult to recognize gradual changes that alter the underlying system. And the connection to the wider river network continues to play a role in this dynamic because it introduces external influences that interact with the locally shaped environment. And these influences can either reinforce existing patterns or introduce variations that require adjustment, and the ability of the settlement to integrate these influences becomes an important factor in maintaining balance within the system. And at the same time, the increasing degree of interaction between human activity and environmental processes introduces new forms of vulnerability, because the more the landscape is shaped by repeated use, the more the stability of the move. Community depends on the continued functioning of those modified systems, and disruptions, whether gradual or sudden, can have effects that are amplified by the interconnected nature of the environment and human activity, making it more difficult to isolate or respond to change. And from a broader perspective, this stage reflects a point where the development of a large settlement involves not only adapting to the environment, but participating in its transformation over time, creating a system where human, environmental processes are closely intertwined. And this integration can support long-term stability, while also embedding within it the potential for change that may not be immediately visible. And this raises an important question, because as the landscape becomes increasingly shaped by human activity, what determines whether these changes continue to support the community or begin to alter the conditions in ways that are harder to detect until their effects become more difficult to reverse? As the landscape continues to be shaped by repeated human activity over long periods of time, the effects of these changes begin to extend beyond what can be directly observed in a single generation, because the accumulation of small modifications can gradually alter the balance between different environmental processes. And this alteration may not appear as a sudden transformation, but as a slow shift in how the system behaves under familiar conditions. And over time, this can influence how water flows through the land, how nutrients are distributed within the soil, and how plant communities respond to seasonal cycles, creating a situation where the environment that once supported stable patterns of life begins to change in ways that are subtle but persistent. And these changes are not necessarily the result of intentional design, but emerge from the interaction between human practices and natural systems that respond to repeated use. And within this evolving dynamic, the predictability that once may begin to weaken because patterns that were previously reliable no longer produce the same outcomes. And this does not mean that the environment becomes entirely unstable, but that its responses become less consistent, requiring individuals to adjust their expectations and strategies in order to maintain balance. And this adjustment can involve shifting the locations of activity, altering the timing of resource use, or modifying practices that were once effective. And each of these responses reflects an attempt to realign human behavior with a system that is gradually changing beneath the surface. And from an archaeological perspective, such shifts may be difficult to identify directly because they do not always produce clear or immediate markers, but can be inferred from changes in patterns of settlement, use, resource distribution, or material remains that suggest a reorganization of daily life. And while these indicators must be interpreted with caution, they provide a window into how communities respond to environmental change, not through abrupt transformation, but through gradual adaptation that unfolds over time. And from a biological and social viewpoint, living within an environment that is slowly changing can influence how individuals perceive stability, because the differences from one moment to the next may be too small to notice, while their cumulative effect becomes significant only over longer periods. And this can create a sense of continuity that masks underlying shifts, making it more challenging to recognize when established practices are no longer aligned with current conditions. And this gap between perception and reality can affect how quickly and effectively the community responds to change. And the connection to the broader river network continues to interact with these processes, because variations in water flow or regional conditions can amplify or modify local changes. And this interaction adds another layer of complexity to the system, where local practices and wider environmental patterns influence one another in ways that are not always predictable, and the ability of the settlement to adjust to these combined influences becomes an important factor in maintaining stability. And at the same time, the increasing interdependence between human activity and environmental processes means that responses to change are constrained by the systems that have already been established, because practices that rely on modified landscapes cannot always be easily replaced or relocated. And this constraint can limit the range of possible adaptations, creating a situation where adjustments must occur within a framework that is itself part of the problem. And from a broader perspective, this stage reflects a point where the long-term interaction between humans and their environment begins to produce conditions that require continuous adjustment rather than stable repetition. And this transition does not occur suddenly, but emerges from the accumulation of many small changes that gradually alter the balance of the system. And this raises an important question, because as the environment continues to shift in response to both human activity and broader natural processes, what determines whether the community can adapt its practices in time to maintain stability, or begins to encounter limits that make those adaptations increasingly difficult to achieve? As the gradual changes in the environment continue to accumulate over extended periods, the settlement begins to encounter conditions where adaptation is no longer a matter of small adjustments within familiar patterns, but may require shifts that challenge the existing relationship between people and the 16 use and the land. Because when the systems that have been shaped by generations of use begin to behave differently, the strategies that once maintained stability may become less effective. And this does not happen all at once, but emerges through a growing mismatch between expectation and outcome, where actions that previously produced reliable results begin to yield uncertain or reduced returns. And this shift can be difficult to recognize in its early stages, because each individual change may appear minor while their combined effect alters the overall balance of the system. And within this context, the dependence on modified landscapes becomes more apparent, because the community's way of life is closely tied to conditions that have developed over time and cannot be easily recreated elsewhere. And this creates a form of constraint where options for response are shaped by the existing structure of the environment as much as by the choices available to the people. And while movement or reorganization may remain possible in principle, the scale and complexity of the settlement make such changes more difficult to implement without affecting many aspects of daily life. And from an archaeological perspective, evidence of this stage may appear as shifts in how space is used, or as changes in the intensity of activity across different areas of the settlement. And while these patterns do not provide direct explanations, they suggest that the community was responding to changing conditions in ways that altered its internal organization, reflecting an ongoing process of adjustment rather than a single moment of transformation. And from a biological and social viewpoint, living within a system that is becoming less predictable can influence how individuals perceive risk and stability, because the gap between expectation and outcome introduces uncertainty that must be managed not only through practical adjustments but also through changes in how people understand their relationship to the environment. And this can affect decision-making by increasing the importance of flexibility, while also highlighting the limits of practices that once provided a sense of control. And the connection to the wider river network continues to interact with these developments, because broader environmental variations can intensify local changes or introduce new pressures that compound existing challenges. And this interaction creates a layered system where local and regional processes influence one another, making it more complex to identify the sources of change or to predict their consequences. And at the same time, the persistence of established social and spatial patterns may slow the pace at which the community can respond to these shifts, because systems that have developed to support stability can also resist change even when adaptation becomes necessary. And this resistance does not imply failure, but reflects the inherent tension between maintaining continuity and responding to new conditions. And from a broader perspective, this stage represents a point where the long-term interaction between humans and their environment reaches a threshold where the balance that once supported growth and stability becomes more difficult to sustain. And this threshold is not defined by a single event, but by the cumulative effect of many changes that gradually alter the conditions under which the settlement operates. And this raises a central question, because as the community faces a landscape that is no longer fully aligned with its established practices, what determines whether it can reorganize in ways that restore balance or begins to experience a decline that unfolds over time without a clear boundary between continuity and transformation? As the settlement enters a phase where environmental and social pressures begin to interact more visibly, the patterns that once supported stability may start to show subtle signs of strain, not through sudden collapse, but through gradual changes in how daily life is organized. Because when systems of production, storage, and coordination are closely interconnected, even small disruptions can ripple across the entire structure. And these disruptions may come from variations in climate shifts, in water flow, or changes in the availability of key resources. And while each factor alone might be manageable, their combined effects can alter the balance that the community has relied on for generations. And this alteration does not immediately lead to abandonment, but begins as a series of adjustments where familiar routines are modified in response to conditions that no longer behave as expected. And within this context, the experience of living in the settlement may begin to change in ways that are not always visible in material remains, because individuals must navigate increasing uncertainty while still maintaining the patterns that support collective life, and this can involve reallocating effort, shifting the use of space, or adapting the timing of activities in order to respond to changing conditions. And these responses reflect a process of continuous adjustment, where the goal is not to restore a previous state, but to find a new balance within an evolving system. And from an archaeological perspective, such changes may be reflected in variations in the intensity of occupation across different areas, or in the modification of existing structures rather than the creation of entirely new ones. And while these patterns do not provide direct explanations, they suggest that the community was actively responding to changing conditions by reconfiguring its internal organization. And this reconfiguration indicates that the settlement was still functioning, even as it adapted to new challenges. And from a biological and social viewpoint, increasing uncertainty can influence how individuals perceive risk and cooperation, because maintaining stability in a changing environment requires coordinated responses that depend on trust and shared understanding. And as conditions become less predictable, the importance of these social factors may increase, even as they are tested by the pressures of adaptation, creating a dynamic where cooperation becomes both more necessary and more difficult to sustain. And the connection to the wider river network continues to play a role in shaping these developments, because external influences can either alleviate or intensify local pressures. And this interaction creates a complex system where the settlement is affected by both internal dynamics and broader environmental patterns, and the ability to navigate this complexity becomes a key factor in determining how the community responds to emerging challenges. And at the same time, the persistence of established systems can limit the range of possible responses, because practices that have developed to support stability may not easily accommodate rapid or significant change, and this constraint can create a situation where adaptation occurs within a pred+i narrowing set of options, increasing the difficulty of maintaining balance as conditions continue to shift. And from a broader perspective, this stage reflects a point where the accumulated effects of environmental change and social complexity begin to converge, creating conditions that require ongoing adjustment rather than stable repetition, and this convergence does not produce a single defining moment, but unfolds over time as the settlement continues to respond to challenges that are both familiar and new. And this raises an important question, because as these pressures continue to shape the life of the community, what determines whether its responses will sustain its continuity or gradually lead to patterns of change that move it away from the form it once maintained? As the pressures affecting the settlement continue to accumulate, the responses that once helped maintain balance may begin to interact with one another in ways that create additional strain, because when multiple adjustments are made within an already interconnected system, each change can influence the effectiveness of others, and this interaction can produce outcomes that are difficult to anticipate, even when each individual action is reasonable in isolation. And over time, this can lead to a situation where efforts to stabilize one part of the system introduce new challenges in another, creating a pattern where adaptation becomes increasingly complex rather than progressively resolving the underlying issues. And within this evolving dynamic, the coordination required to manage these overlapping responses may begin to stretch the social structures that have supported the community up to this point, because as decisions become more interconnected, the need for alignment across different groups increases, and maintaining this alignment can become more difficult as conditions change in uneven ways across the settlement. And this does not necessarily lead to immediate breakdown, but can introduce subtle variations in how different parts of the community respond to shared challenges, and these variations can affect the overall coherence of the system. And from an archaeological perspective, such processes may be reflected in changes that appear uneven across the settlement, such as differences in the intensity of activity or in how certain areas are maintained or modified. And while these patterns do not provide direct explanations, they suggest that the community was experiencing internal variation in how it responded to external pressures, and this variation indicates that the system was adjusting in multiple directions at once, rather than following a single coordinated path. And from a biological and social viewpoint, navigating a system where responses become more complex can influence how individuals perceive their ability to affect outcomes, because when actions produce less predictable results, the connection between effort and consequence becomes less clear, and this can shape behavior by encouraging caution or by leading to adjustments in how decisions are made within the context of uncertainty. And these shifts in perception can in turn influence how cooperation is maintained within the community. And the connection to the wider river network continues to interact with these developments, because external conditions can either reinforce or disrupt local adjustments. And this interaction adds another layer of variability to a system that is already managing multiple internal responses, and the ability of the settlement to integrate these influences becomes increasingly important as the complexity of the system grows. And at the same time, the persistence of established patterns of organization may limit the flexibility needed to respond effectively to these overlapping challenges, because systems that have developed to support stability can resist changes that alter their underlying structure, and this resistance can create a tension where the need for adaptation increases even as the capacity to implement it becomes more constrained. And from a broader perspective, this stage reflects a point where the interaction between environmental change and social complexity produces conditions in which adaptation is no longer a straightforward process of adjustment, but becomes a series of interconnected responses that must be managed simultaneously. And this complexity does not lead to an immediate outcome, but creates a landscape of possibilities where different paths may be taken depending on how the community navigates these challenges. And this raises an important question, because as the system becomes more intricate and the outcomes of actions less predictable, what determines whether the community can maintain enough coordination to continue adapting, or begins to experience patterns of divergence that gradually alter its overall structure? As the accumulation of pressures and overlapping responses continues over time, the settlement may begin to enter a phase where the coherence that once allowed it to function as a unified system becomes more difficult to sustain, not because of a single decisive event, but because the connections that link different parts of the community are gradually stretched by the increasing complexity of maintaining balance. And this stretching does not necessarily break those connections immediately, but can weaken them in ways that reduce the effectiveness of coordinated action. And as a result, the patterns that once aligned activities across the settlement may begin to diverge as different groups or areas respond to changing conditions in ways that are locally effective but not always consistent with one another. And within this context, the experience of daily life may begin to vary more noticeably across the settlement because the conditions that shape resource availability, social interaction, and spatial organization are no longer uniform, and this variation can lead to differences in how people perceive stability and risk depending on their position within the system. And while such differences do not automatically produce conflict, they can influence how decisions are made and how cooperation is maintained across the broader community. And over time, these localized responses may create a pattern where the settlement functions less as a single coordinated entity and more as a collection of interconnected but partially independent segments. And from an archaeological perspective, this phase may be reflected in changes that suggest uneven patterns of occupation or activity, where some areas show signs of continued use while others appear to decline or be repurposed, and while these patterns do not provide direct explanations, they indicate that the internal organization of the settlement was changing in ways that affected how space was utilized and maintained. And this shifting pattern of use can be understood as part of a broader process of reorganization rather than as a simple reduction in activity. And from a biological and social viewpoint, living within a system that is becoming less uniformly coordinated can influence how individuals navigate relationships, because the expectations that once guided interaction may no longer be shared to the same extent across the entire community, and this can lead to adjustments in how trust, cooperation, and responsibility are managed within smaller groups, while the connections between those groups become more variable. And this shift does not necessarily imply a breakdown of social structure, but reflects a transformation in how that structure operates under changing conditions. And the connection to the wider river network continues to interact with these developments because external influences may affect different parts of the settlement in different ways, amplifying the unevenness of local conditions, further shaping the pattern of responses. And this interaction adds another layer to the process where internal dynamics and external factors combine to influence how the community evolves. And at the same time, the persistence of established practices and attachments to specific places may limit the speed or extent of reorganization, because continuity remains an important part of how individuals relate to the settlement even as conditions change, and this can create a situation where adaptation occurs gradually through shifts in emphasis, rather than through abrupt transformation, allowing the system to change while still maintaining elements of its previous structure. And from a broader perspective, this stage represents a point where the cumulative effects of environmental change, social complexity, and adaptive response lead to a reconfiguration of how the settlement functions as a whole, not as a clear transition from one state to another, but as an ongoing process where patterns of coordination become more distributed and less centralized. And this raises a central question, because as the settlement continues to evolve under these conditions, what determines whether this process of reorganization allows it to persist in a different form or contributes to a gradual fading of the structures that once sustained its scale and coherence over time? As the settlement continues through this phase of gradual reorganization, the patterns that once supported its large-scale coherence begin to shift in ways that change how presence is distributed across the landscape, not through a single movement away, but through a slow redistribution of activity, where some areas become less central while others maintain or even increase their use. And this process does not necessarily indicate a clear decision to leave, but reflects a series of adjustments where individuals and groups respond to local conditions by altering where and how they invest their time and effort. And over time, these adjustments can create a pattern where the overall density of occupation becomes more uneven, suggesting a transition from concentrated coordination toward a more dispersed form of habitation. And within this changing pattern, the experience of the settlement as a unified place may begin to soften because the shared rhythms that once aligned movement and activity across the entire area become less synchronized. And this does not mean that connections disappear, but that they operate at different scales, with some relationships remaining strong within smaller groups while broader coordination becomes less consistent. And this shift can influence how individuals perceive their connection to the larger community, because the sense of belonging that was once reinforced by regular interaction across the settlement may now be shaped more by localized networks of interaction. And from an archaeological perspective, such transitions may be reflected in changes in the distribution of material remains, where certain zones show a reduction in activity, while others continue to display signs of occupation. And while these patterns must be interpreted carefully, they suggest that the use of space was becoming more selective rather than uniformly maintained, indicating a reconfiguration of how the settlement functioned as a whole, rather than an abrupt cessation of activity. And from a biological and social viewpoint, adapting to a more distributed pattern of habitation can influence how cooperation is organized, because the coordination that once relied on proximity must now be maintained across greater distances or through less frequent interaction. And this can lead to adjustments in how information is shared, how responsibilities are managed, and how trust is sustained within the community. And these adjustments may support continuity at a smaller scale, even as the larger structure becomes less cohesive. And the connection to the wider river network continues to shape these developments, because movement along the river may provide alternative pathways for interaction and resource access, allowing parts of the population to remain connected, even as the central concentration of activity changes. And this interaction highlights how the settlement was always part of a broader system, where changes in one area could be balanced by connections to others. And at the same time, the persistence of established places and patterns may slow the rate at which this redistribution occurs, because attachments to specific locations continue to influence decisions about where to remain or where to move. And this creates a situation where change unfolds gradually, through a series of overlapping adjustments rather than through a single coordinated shift, allowing elements of the original structure to remain visible even as the overall pattern evolves. And from a broader perspective, this stage reflects a point where the transformation of the settlement becomes more visible in the distribution of activity across the landscape, showing how a system that once supported a large and concentrated population can shift toward a different form without a clear boundary between presence and absence. And this raises an important question, because as activity becomes more dispersed and less synchronized, what determines whether these changes represent a reorganization into a new stable pattern or a gradual movement away from the mathage conditions that once allowed the settlement to exist at its original scale? As the redistribution of activity across the landscape continues, the traces of coordinated life that once defined the settlement begin to fade, not through disappearance, but through dilution, where the intensity of use that once marked certain places gradually lessens and becomes harder to distinguish from the surrounding environment. And this process does not erase the past, but blends it into a broader pattern where the boundaries between areas of concentrated activity and areas of limited use become less clear. And over time, this blending can alter how the settlement exists within the landscape, because it no longer stands out as a single organized system, but becomes part of a more diffuse pattern of human presence that is distributed across space in a less centralized way. And within this changing context, the meaning of place may begin to shift, because locations that once held consistent roles within the community are no longer used with the same regularity or intensity. And this does not necessarily remove their significance, but changes how that significance is expressed as the repeated actions that once reinforced their role become less frequent. And as a result, the connection between space and shared experience becomes more variable, with different groups maintaining different relationships to the same locations depending on their needs and circumstances. And from an archaeological perspective, this stage may be reflected in a reduction in the density of material remains in areas that were once heavily used, alongside the continued presence of activity in other locations. And while these patterns do not provide a direct narrative, they suggest that the organization of the settlement was becoming less uniform, indicating a shift away from centralized coordination toward a more dispersed and flexible use of space. And this shift can be understood as part of a broader process where the structure of the community adapts to changing conditions by redistributing rather than eliminating activity. And from a biological and social viewpoint, living within a more diffuse pattern of habitation can influence how individuals experience connection and continuity, because the shared rhythms that once aligned large groups are replaced by smaller and more localized patterns of interaction, and this can support resilience at a local level while also reducing the sense of cohesion across the larger population. And this change in scale may alter how cooperation is maintained, as relationships become more dependent on direct interaction within smaller networks, and the connection to the wider river network continues to play a role in shaping these developments because it provides pathways through which dispersed groups can remain connected even as the central concentration of activity declines. And this interaction highlights how the settlement was always part of a larger system where movement and exchange could occur beyond the immediate boundaries of any single location. And at the same time, the persistence of earlier structures and modified landscapes means that the effects of the settlement do not disappear even as its organization changes, because the environment continues to bear the imprint of past activity influencing how future use unfolds. And this creates a layered landscape where traces of previous patterns coexist with emerging ones. And from a broader perspective, this stage reflects a point where the transformation of the settlement becomes visible as a gradual fading of centralized coordination rather than a clear ending. And this fading does not imply absence, but indicates a shift in how human presence is organized across the landscape. And this raises an important question, because as the visible structure of the settlement becomes less distinct, what determines whether its legacy continues through new forms of organization or becomes part of a background pattern that no longer supports the scale of life it once sustained. As the fading of concentrated activity continues over extended periods, the settlement gradually transitions into a state where its presence is no longer defined by a single recognizable structure, but by a series of dispersed traces that remain embedded within the landscape. And these traces do not disappear entirely but persist in altered forms where previous patterns of construction, movement, and interaction leave subtle influences on how space is organized and used. And over time, this creates a condition where the settlement is not so much abandoned as transformed into a different kind of presence, one that exists through its effects rather than through a clearly defined center. And this transformation unfolds slowly through overlapping processes where the intensity of human activity diminishes in some areas while continuing in others, creating a mosaic of use that reflects both continuity and change. And within this evolving pattern, the memory of the settlement may no longer be maintained through consistent shared practices, but becomes distributed across smaller groups or localized traditions where elements of past activity are retained in ways that are adapted to new conditions. And this does not imply a complete loss of continuity, but rather a reconfiguration of how continuity is expressed as the large-scale coordination that once unified, the community gives way to more fragmented forms of connection, and these forms can sustain certain aspects of the previous system while allowing others to fade. And from an archaeological perspective, this stage may be reflected in the persistence of certain features or modifications within the landscape, even as the overall density of occupation decreases. And while these remnants do not provide a complete account, they indicate that the settlement has left an imprint that continues to shape how the area is experienced and utilized, and this imprint can influence subsequent patterns of habitation by providing a framework that later activity may follow or adapt. And from a biological and social viewpoint, living within a landscape that carries the traces of earlier large-scale organization can influence how individuals relate to space, because the environment they encounter is already structured by past activity, even if its original context is no longer fully present. And this can create a layered experience where current practices interact with inherited patterns in ways that shape behavior and perception without requiring explicit awareness. And the connection to the wider river network remains relevant because it continues to provide pathways for movement and interaction that link dispersed groups across the region. And this ongoing connectivity ensures that even as the centralized form of the settlement fades, the broader system of relationships within which it existed continues to evolve. And at the same time, the gradual nature of this transformation means that there is no clear boundary between the settlement as it once was and the landscape that follows, because elements of the former persist within the latter, creating continuity that is difficult to define in simple terms of presence or absence. And this ambiguity reflects the way complex systems change not through sudden endings, but through processes that redistribute and reconfigure their components over time. And from a broader perspective, this stage represents a point where the idea of disappearance becomes less about a moment of vanishing and more about a shift in form, where the structures that once supported a large and coordinated population are no longer visible in the same way but continue to exist through their lasting effects on the environment and on subsequent patterns of human activity. And this raises a central question, because when a settlement no longer appears as a unified entity, yet continues to influence the landscape and the people who move through it in quieter ways, can it truly be said to have vanished? Or has it simply become something that is harder to recognize within the flow of time? As the traces of the settlement continue to persist within the landscape without forming a single visible structure, the question of what it means for a place to disappear begins to shift from a matter of physical absence to one of perception and recognition. Because when the patterns that once defined a large and coordinated community are no longer concentrated in a single location, they can become difficult to identify, even if their effects remain present. And this difficulty does not arise from a lack of evidence, but from the way that evidence is distributed across space and time, making it less immediately apparent to those who encounter it later. And in this sense, the settlement does not vanish in a sudden or complete way, but gradually moves beyond the threshold of what can be easily recognized as a unified system. And within this changing framework, the landscape itself becomes a record not of a single moment of abandonment, but of a long process of transformation, where different layers of activity overlap and interact, and these layers do not always align in a clear sequence, because the processes that shape them occur at different rates and under different conditions, and this complexity can make it challenging to reconstruct a linear narrative of what happened, because the evidence reflects multiple pathways of change rather than a single direction, and as a result, the understanding of the settlement must be approached as an interpretation of patterns rather than a direct account of events. And from an archaeological perspective, this stage highlights the limits of what material remains can reveal, because while they provide valuable information about how space was used and modified, they do not fully capture the experiences, decisions and adaptations that shaped those patterns, and this gap between evidence and interpretation requires a careful approach that avoids drawing conclusions beyond what can be supported, while still recognizing the broader processes that the evidence suggests. And this balance is essential for maintaining a grounded understanding of how complex human systems change over time. And from a biological and social viewpoint, the gradual transformation of the settlement reflects broader aspects of human adaptation, because it shows how communities respond to changing conditions, not only through visible actions, but through shifts in behavior, perception, and organization that may leave only indirect traces. And this highlights the importance of viewing human history as a continuous process where change is often distributed across many small adjustments, rather than concentrated in a single defining moment. And the connection to the wider river network remains part of this perspective, because it reminds us that the settlement was never isolated, but always existed within a larger system of movement and interaction, and this broader context continues to influence how patterns of habitation evolve even after the central concentration of activity has diminished, showing that the legacy of the settlement extends beyond its original boundaries. And at the same time, the persistence of environmental modifications and spatial patterns demonstrates that the influence of the settlement does not end when its visible structure fades, because the landscape continues to reflect the accumulated effects of past activity shaping how it is experienced and used in the future. And this continuity suggests that disappearance is not an absolute condition, but a transition in how presence is expressed. And from a broader perspective, this stage invites a reconsideration of the idea of vanishing because it shows that large human communities may not simply end, but can transform in ways that redistribute their influence across time and space, making it less visible but still significant. And this perspective does not provide a single answer to what happened, but frames the question in a way that acknowledges the complexity of long-term change. And this leads to a final reflection, because if a place can persist through its effects, even after its form is no longer clearly visible, then how should we understand the boundary between existence and disappearance when looking at the deep history of human life? As the idea of disappearance becomes less about a single event and more about a gradual shift in how a place is perceived, the understanding of the settlement begins to depend not only on what remains in the ground, but also on how those remains are interpreted across time, because the traces that persist do not carry a fixed meaning and instead require each generation to reconstruct their significance based on available knowledge and perspective. And this process of interpretation is shaped by the limits of evidence as well as by the frameworks used to understand it, and over time these frameworks can change, leading to different ways of seeing the same patterns without altering the material itself. And this means that the settlement exists not only as a physical imprint, but also as an evolving idea that is continually reassembled through study and reflection. And within this context, the absence of a clear ending becomes an important feature because it prevents the narrative from settling into a simple explanation and instead leaves space for multiple possibilities that must be weighed against. The evidence, and this does not imply uncertainty in a negative sense, but reflects the reality that complex systems often change through processes that do not produce a single defining moment, and as a result the effort to understand what happened becomes an ongoing inquiry rather than a completed conclusion. And from an archaeological perspective, this stage highlights the importance of cautious interpretation, because the distribution of material remains can suggest patterns of change without specifying their causes, and this requires an approach that connects evidence to broader processes such as environmental variation, social reorganization, and long-term adaptation, while avoiding claims that extend beyond what can be supported. And this careful balance allows the settlement to be understood as part of a wider pattern of human history, rather than as an isolated case. And from a biological and social viewpoint, the gradual transformation of the settlement reflects how human communities manage change over long periods by adjusting their behavior and organization in response to shifting conditions, and this perspective emphasizes continuity within change, showing that even as large-scale structures become less visible, the underlying processes of adaptation remain active, shaping how people live within their environment. And the connection to the wider river network remains relevant, because it situates the settlement within a broader system where movement, exchange, and interaction continue beyond the boundaries of any single location. And this broader context helps explain how elements of the community could persist or be redistributed even as the central concentration of activity diminished. And at the same time, the persistence of modified landscapes and spatial patterns demonstrates that the influence of the settlement extends into the future, not as a preserved form, but as a set of conditions that shape subsequent activity. And this continuity suggests that the effects of human action can remain embedded within the environment long after the original organization has changed. And from a broader perspective, this stage invites a deeper reflection on how we define the existence of a place, because it shows that what appears to be disappearance may instead be a transition into forms that are less immediately visible, but still active within the landscape and within the processes of interpretation that seek to understand it. And this reflection does not resolve the question posed at the beginning, but brings it into clearer focus. Because if a settlement can persist through its influence, even as its structure dissolves, then how should we distinguish between something that has truly vanished and something that has simply moved beyond the limits of our current ways of seeing? As the long process of transformation settles into the landscape, the question of disappearance becomes less about identifying an ending and more about understanding how continuity can exist without a clear form, because the settlement that once gathered people into a visible and coordinated structure has not simply ceased but has dispersed into patterns that continue to shape both environment and behavior in quieter ways. And this quiet persistence invites a different kind of attention, one that does not look for a single moment of loss but instead observes how traces endure through the systems they helped create. And in this sense, the settlement becomes part of a broader rhythm where human presence is always in the process of forming, dissolving, and reforming across time. And within this perspective, the idea of a city larger than what we might compare it to does not rest only on its size, but on its ability to organize relationships between people, space, and resources at a scale that leaves lasting effects. And when that organization changes or disperses, the scale does not vanish instantly, but is redistributed into smaller patterns that carry elements of the original structure. And these patterns may no longer produce the same concentration of activity, yet they continue to influence how the landscape is used and understood. And this influence becomes part of the ongoing story of human adaptation rather than a closed chapter. And from an archaeological viewpoint, what remains is not a complete narrative, but a set of signals that point toward processes rather than events. And these signals require careful interpretation because they reflect both presence and change at the same time. And by following these patterns across space and time, it becomes possible to see how large human systems can transform without leaving a single clear marker of their conclusion. And this approach allows the settlement to be understood not as a mystery waiting for a final answer, but as an example of how complexity evolves. And from a biological and social perspective, the gradual redistribution of life across the landscape reflects how human communities respond to limits by adjusting their scale and organization. And this adjustment is not necessarily a failure, but part of a wider pattern in which systems expand, stabilize, and then reorganize as conditions change. And this cycle can be observed in different forms across human history, suggesting that the experience of transformation is not unique, but a recurring aspect of how societies interact with their environment. And the connection to the wider network of rivers and surrounding regions remains part of this process because it provides continuity beyond the boundaries of any single settlement, allowing movement, exchange, and adaptation to continue even as local structures change. And this continuity shows that while one form of organization may fade, others can emerge, drawing on the same pathways and resources in new ways. And at the same time, the landscape retains the imprint of what came before, not as a fixed memory, but as a set of conditions that influence future possibilities. And this imprint shapes how new patterns of life develop, creating a link between past and present that does not depend on direct awareness. And in this way, the settlement persists, not as a visible city, but as part of the environment itself, woven into the processes that support ongoing human activity. And from a broader perspective, this final stage does not close the question posed at the beginning, but reframes it because, instead of asking why the city vanished, it invites us to consider how human systems change when the balance that supports them shifts. And this reflection carries a quiet message that extends beyond a single place, showing that stability is often temporary and that continuity can exist even when form is lost. And as the traces of the settlement remain within the landscape and within the patterns of human adaptation that follow, it leaves us with a final thought to hold on to, because if something can continue to shape the world long after it is no longer clearly seen, then what does it truly mean for anything in human history to disappear?